Tony, it's well documented that companies have lots of strategies that they set out to do, but very few of these actually get executed.
So I think there's a lot of focus about the date and getting the product or service in, but we don't really think about the activities up front that we need to gear in order to make sure that it can be delivered successfully and be operationally successful.
If you can give us, in your experience, what are some of the projects that come to mind where success and delivery and tracking post-implementation has been successful?
I think from my experience, I've had a lot of workings in the banks in South Africa and across Africa. I've been fortunate enough to work on the Barclays Absa merger and acquisition, and I recently came as a consultant from Standard Bank. And I have seen projects that show that tracking initiative. It's normally done by the project itself. I normally see the gap is where does it go to after it becomes operational. So when it does, finally the project is closed and the resources move on to the next initiative, is it being tracked successfully from that operation? I'm sad to say I probably see the reverse more than the right practice.
There's also a big question around who should be in charge of projects and executing projects. We've seen companies bring in external resources, build specialized project teams, or have ad hoc teams. What's the best approach for a company to execute a project?
You know, every project's different in different sectors, different complexity and size of projects, but I think there's certain principles that organizations need to think about. For example, good governance will tell you need a project board. So you need to have the right people representing the change. Do we have the right executive support? Do we have the people there that need to instill the change once the product or service is in production? So that's the starting point, just to make sure that we've got the right senior level of support. From there, we then need to look at, well, who needs to deliver and instill the change? So if I think of the role of the project manager, whether it's someone internally or they're bringing in a consultant, the role and responsibility of the project manager should be clearly depicted up front. You know, they normally are going to be accountable to deliver the change successfully and make sure they're doing it within time and on the set budget. But again, business plays a role. It doesn't help me trying to get something in an execution phase if I don't have the involvement from the right people from the business. At the end of the day, when the project's delivered, it's up to the business to ensure they're using that asset or service in production to get the benefit.
Often that's where the baton gets dropped. Project is completed, and now what happens? How does one ensure that there's continuity post-implementation?
Yeah, of course, that's a very good question. If you look at projects, they don't show tangible benefits during the life cycle. It's afterwards. So I guess the question is, what are companies doing to make sure that they're actually getting the value for their buck? They do a cost-benefit analysis normally up front. They'll do a business case. They'll say, by spending X, we're going to make Y over time, but they don't track the Y. They don't make sure that they can actually meet these tangible benefits. So I guess what they need to start thinking about is benefits realization and tracking as a practice in the business. You know, it sounds great in templates and governance, but do they actually practice this? You know, from my personal experience, most organizations, when they deliver, they move on. They just say, well, this is an operational need now. But are they tracking? Are they putting the pressure on the operation to say, you were going to show the following increase in revenue or cost reduction benefit? What are you doing with the product or service we've given you to meet that objective? I normally say a good standard is to track benefits for at least 2 years. Again, different for every industry, but I think 2 years would be a good way to see, are we getting traction on the benefits we aim to achieve?
One of the critical success factors is having a project sponsor, and that's usually one of the executives in an organization. How critical is it to have a sponsor that looks after projects and supports it going forward?
It's probably the number one. You know, if I look at the literature out there, there's a report that gets published once a year called the Chaos Report. It looks at global success and failure rates of projects. And in that report, they actually come up with what they call the top 10 success factors. Number one is executive support. And I like to use the word active support. You know, are they making sure they're setting the vision? You know, a lot of the times they're there to guide you, but then are they there when it comes to the day-to-day management of the project? Are they providing the right guidance? Are they protecting what I call the scope of the project? Are they making decisions? You know, sometimes not making a decision is worse than the wrong decision. So how active are they in the day-to-day of the project? So definitely number one in terms of the success factors.
What happens when a project doesn't meet deadlines?
If I think of the economics of a project, you know, if you're driving a date and you can't achieve that date, I guess the question is, A, if time is your constraint, do you have the budget? You might have to increase your budget in order to achieve that date. Is there flexibility to move the date, or do we maybe have to remove some of the scope from the project? And I think those discussions don't happen at the right level. You know, we're very quick to bark and say, we want this to be done on this date, but work with what you have. But do we understand what we're trying to achieve versus what we need to achieve it?
And what happens when you have activities beyond your control, if you've got labor unrest or some other issues?
Sure, there's always that uncertainty, and I guess what makes projects so complex is that there's a lot of variables. And most of the times those variables are out of your control. I call them dependencies. You have many dependencies when you run a project. But again, chance favors the planned mind. So, if you've got what I call that detection orientation way of thinking 5, 6 steps ahead, you probably find you can probably mitigate most risks before they become an issue. And the next word is adapt. If you do have those unforeseen events that you couldn't have planned for, how well can you mitigate? And to be able to mitigate, well, you need to be able to adapt. You need to know your options. You need to know how to use your resources in order to achieve the objective.
Tony, what would be your advice to some government or private companies that are having problems, that are in that challenging phase?
A lot of the times what you find, and I use the word scope creep, is while this project is running, because change, the pace of change is so readable around us that, we don't control that and we end up moving the goalposts. So we have to be very clear about what are we trying to achieve. Once we've done that, we need to think about project approach. How are we going to do this? Do we have the right resource to do so? What resources do we need? There should be really good due diligence and planning up front. I think a lot of the times, because of the pace of change concept again, we're so quick to move, we don't do the right homework up front. So we need to think about the approach, how we're going to instill this. And then I think the best advice I can give companies is to think of sequential delivery. They try to aim for this big picture the whole time without breaking that up into smaller quick wins and saying, what are the 13, 14 key milestones we need to deliver to get to the bigger picture? They're too focused on the bigger picture. And you find yourself that you might be going off a tangent. So, start focusing on project approach. Are we all on the same page? Are we resourced well? Business readiness, sequential delivery, and making sure that we manage the team to that delivery.